Welcome everybody to another Wednesday. Sorry I dropped out last week a little bit early. I had some connectivity issues. I was away. But I hope everybody is safe and healthy and happy. Doesn't look like things are getting a whole lot better in North Carolina right now, but we can cross our fingers and hope for things to get better sometime soon. We will keep doing these midweeks certainly until we're open back up. So however long that takes. Oh, this is being recorded, isn't it? I have that on tape now. But we will keep doing it. We've been enjoying this, and for those of you who live farther away or have a harder time getting in, we'll figure out how to keep these going. You know, Chris mentioned field day tomorrow. We also on Friday, if you have young ones, we also have virtual story time on Friday. So if you have young ones or know of young ones, people need a little bit of a break, you know, they can join for that. And I'd really encourage you to keep an eye on our website, because we have a lot of programming coming up this fall, a lot of really good stuff that's happening. This whole situation has forced our already very creative staff to be even more creative. They've done a great job, so there's a lot happening. Nobody is taking this time off. So today we're going to be talking about some of the Mexican successes in North Carolina. We've been growing Mexican plants for a long time here. It's a group of plants, flora, that JC really loved. Visited plant collected in Mexico and does very well. This talk is based mostly on a trip I took back down there in, I think, 2013. I was visiting with former JCRA Assistant Director Todd Lassane and David Creech from Stephen F. Austin Arboretum at Stephen F. Austin University, I guess, in Nacogdoches, Texas, and a couple of Chinese colleagues. We went down, not so much collecting, but visiting folks, and we were giving a talk at the Botanic Garden at the Mexico City, the University of Mexico City. Although it's in Spanish, so I did not give that in Spanish. Let's see. Go ahead and get into it. But that's kind of where this came from. I was asked to talk about that. It always kind of feels a little unusual to talk about plants that your audience knows more about than you do. But there you go. We do what we can. So like I said, JC really loved the Mexican flora. And here he is with a giant, looks like probably a Cypresses, maybe a Monterey cypress there, down in Mexico. And he did it, you know, hardcore, old school, in the tents, got all the food in the cooler there. We stayed in hotels. Our Mexican host was a graduate of NC State. He had actually, if you're familiar with, you may know Jesse Perry, who works with the Natural Science Museum. Jesse Perry's father, also Jesse Perry, wrote a book, The Pines of Mexico. And our Mexican host, when I visited, Teobaldo, was a graduate student of working with Jesse Perry Sr., I guess, and spent a lot of time out in the roaming around Mexico with him. So it was really a treat to get to know him when we went. But we stayed in hotels and things, so we're not quite as tough as them. But you know, in the places where most of the people who are collecting in Mexico in the past, who are collecting to introduce plants into at least the East Coast, most are really collecting in the northeast part of Mexico. Texas, you've had the Edwards Plateau, which goes over into Mexico, Tamaulipas, Nuevo Leon, some of those areas. Those tend to be areas with a little bit more similar climates than what we have, higher elevation, so they get some cold weather. And yeah, in some cases, more moisture. But one of the things we were going to see was the Arbol de Tule. And all through this, if I use any Spanish, you just have to forgive me. My parents were Cajun and I took French, and so Spanish is not my strong suit. But the Arbol de Tule is the oldest living Mexican bald cypress, Taxodium mucronatum. And it is massive. It's hard to get a picture showing how big it is. That's the trunk. The trunk has a diameter of 14 meters. It's not a circumference, diameter. So it is just huge. And they say it's probably 2,000 years old. And it's interesting, it's out in this plaza, there's a church there, and as they paved over everything, this tree started going downhill. And what they realized was not so much that they were impacting the roots, but there was underground water moving through there, groundwater, that they were blocking. And so it was staying too dry. So they basically opened up channels under all the hardscaping around there to let kind of these natural underground waterways keep flowing, and the tree has really bounced back since they've done that. It's absolutely spectacular. I've always tell people I'm not a big tree person. I don't go search out big trees. I know a lot of people who do. It's just not my thing, but boy, it's quite an experience to stand by this thing. You know, and Mexico is important for its, you know, we get a lot of foods from down in Mexico and on all the way through Central and South America. Perhaps the most important is the teosinte. This is the progenitor, the original corn. The teosinte, you know, this is what we bred to become the corn that we eat today. So, you know, people talk about corn coming from Mexico and being moved by native peoples around. And when we think about that, you know, we always think about, you know, these big, huge ears of corn that we eat today, you know, the Silver Queen and things like that. That's really fairly modern. For years, they were cultivating it and growing it and selecting forms. But when you see this and it's a little grassy stage and this being the young seed head, you know, it kind of makes more sense. I remember when I was young and they were talking about corn being a grain like wheat and rye. It didn't make sense to me that it was a grain like that. But when you see this, you're like, oh yeah, I can see where this looks like what I know of grains. And so just over time, it was improved until we get to the point we are today. It's pretty amazing. And you know, I was actually born in New Mexico. So I was born down in the Southwest, but moved away when I was very young. And, you know, I've been back to, you know, Phoenix and Santa Fe and Southern California. I've been to Mexico, but mostly just across the border. And, you know, I think I'm like most people where when I think of Mexican flora, I think of, you know, cactus and agave and thorny things and really dry scrub. But there's a lot more down there. Now, this is not, haven't gotten into the successes in America yet. But this is Gunnera mexicana. Gunnera is mostly, other than really pretty much Mexico, is a southern hemisphere plant in New Zealand and Australia and South America. Here you kind of see the size. This is Dr. Yin Yulong, one of the people we were traveling with. Dr. Yulong never smiles unless he's had a couple glasses of sipping tequila. Then he's full of jokes. But, you know, it kind of surprised me to see some of these plants like this in Mexico. And the thing that, you know, you really have to remember is Mexico has an incredibly diverse climate. It is hot and dry in some areas. It's hot and wet in other areas. It's got cool cloud forest areas. It's got wet tropical areas. It's got some of everything other than very, very cold. And even it's got some of that really high up in the mountains. So it really is got this just incredibly diverse landscape. Much of it is subtropical or tropical, so we can't grow it. And I was also fascinated with how many things, you know, we always talk about, you know, why do we go to China to collect? Well, we go because the North American flora and the Asian flora, especially the Eastern North America and the Eastern Asian flora, are so similar. But it was amazing. We'd be out even in these dry areas, and you know, I would see plants like this. We came over looking at it, and I'm like, that's a ziziphus. This is a plant that I only know from Asian plant, Ziziphus jujube, the jujube tree. And over again, I would see these plants that either I knew just from Asia or I knew from Eastern North America and Asia. And so we don't really realize how many plants Mexico, how many genera Mexico has in common with Asia. I did eat the fruit. It had even a thicker peel skin than Ziziphus jujube, but the flesh inside was pretty tasty, kind of that date flavor you get from the jujubes. You know, and there are plants that blew me away, things I did not know existed at all in Mexico. Now, this is a subtropical Clethra, you know, our summer sweet Clethra we can grow, Clethra alnifolia. This Clethra mexicana, and I am going to show one we can grow, a Mexican one we can grow in a little bit, but this thing, I don't know if two of me could put my arms around the trunk of this thing. It was a massive tree. And it was hard to even see the foliage on there, but you can see it's got, this is in a botanic garden, but it's got, you know, vines and epiphytes and all kinds of things growing on it. And there's some branches right there. You can kind of see that Clethra type foliage. But I was constantly blown away with you know, whenever I think I know plants, like I know what Clethra is, then I see something like this and I think, boy, there's so much more to learn. Now we're getting into the ones that we have a little more success with. This nice parking lot tree, used all over Mexico City as a street tree, a Mexico tree, is, believe it or not, a butterfly bush. This is Buddleia cordata, and it is used very widely, and it grows 60, 70, 80 feet tall in Mexico. We grow it here, and we've grown it for a long time. Doesn't look quite the same here. This is it at the Arboretum in the White Garden. You know, for a couple reasons. One, I think when we were growing it originally, we assumed it was like other butterfly bushes and was a shrub, and we cut it back regularly. We didn't try and grow it as a single stem tree. After I first learned that it grew in the wild as a single stem tree, we propagated it and tried to grow it that way. But in a cold winter, it gets knocked back pretty hard, and then it sprouts multiple stems. I think you'd have to get a bit warmer before you could really have it flower, grow as a tree. I think, probably on the warm side of zone 8. But it's got great big leaves, very felted leaves, silvery white on the backside. If you've got space, it's a really pretty plant. Flowers aren't quite as showy as, our butterfly bushes that we tend to think of. But it is nice. You can see this is coming into flower as we're going into fall. You can see the fall color here on the spice bush. But it is a neat plant, and it's not every day that you can get even if you can't grow it as a tree, it's not every day you see one that's like that. Perhaps a little bit easier to use are some of the Mexican marigolds. This is the one, I really like this one, Tagetes lucida. Lucid means shining. This is a plant that's been grown in Mexico. Well, it's native to Mexico, but grown there for ages and used. It was used by the the Aztecs, not the Incas, wrong place. Aztecs, they used the leaves, dried leaves, to flavor chocolate. They burnt it as dried leaves and flowers as incense. And supposedly if you do that, the incense is an insect repellent. It's been used as a tarragon substitute. The dried leaves have kind of a tarragon flavor, although it gets a little spicier than tarragon. That's why it was added to the chocolate, for that little bit of spice. Use it for dyes. They make a tea out of the leaves. It's really used for a lot. So this is a perennial plant for us, kind of shrubby plant, grows upright. What's interesting is in the US, almost all that I've seen are very upright plants. But supposedly there are different forms in Mexico, other ones that are kind of bushier than upright. But it's real pretty, flowers during the summer. Deer won't touch it. And I would bet that if you planted this around places you sat, it would help keep insects away, even without burning it as incense. Similar to the way citronella plants would, scented geraniums. In fact, maybe we need to propagate this so I can plant this where I like to sit outside. That's a good idea. It's a real pretty plant. It's tough as nails, likes a lot of sun, will take drought. Kind of a neat thing. Some people don't love the fragrance on it, although that tends to be not a problem with this. Some of the other Mexican marigolds have real strong fragrances. And I once did a plant buying trip with a colleague of mine, and I bought one of the other Mexican marigolds, and we were driving, and about 2 hours later, he was driving. He pulled over, took out my plant, dumped the pot out on the side of the road, threw the pot back in the car and in the van, and got back in and kept driving. And he was like, I can't stay in a closed van with that thing. Didn't bother me at all. Another herbaceous plant are the wine cups. This is the Mexican wine cups. Now, the native Caliroi involucrata that you may be more familiar with has a really bright fuchsia colored flower. And that doesn't work in all landscapes. So if you need something to tone that down, this Mexican one is much lighter colored flower and much finer dissected leaves here. These are here, if you see, this is one leaf, so very finely dissected leaves. So, but it grows kind of typical of Caliroi involucrata. It comes out in the spring and it spreads. It only grows, if it's not crawling through something, it only grows about 8 inches or so tall, but it'll spread out, 30 inches or more across. And so you have this fine foliage and these flowers that kind of mingle with other things. It's very long blooming. This tenuissima is exceptionally long blooming. So you get it from kind of mid to late spring on through much of the summer. And then when it really peters out with its flowering, you can just cut it back, and you cut it back back to the rosettes. It kind of wants to start dying back to those rosettes. So you just cut it back. It'll shoot out a few more flowers, but then over winter you just have these nice small rosettes of foliage. So it's a really easy perennial to, it's one that covers ground without taking over. Like other things can grow up through there. This is pretty typical. These flowers, they're pale pink, and you either get lighter pink on the edges of the leaves, or sometimes on edges of the petals, or really almost completely white along there on either side. So it gives you almost a little picotee or pinwheel look to it. Really just delicate looking plant that is super, super tough. Love it. Now, somebody mentioned before we got started that they love the rain lilies, the Zephranthes that were flowering because we were getting some good rain. There are a lot of rain lilies, a lot of them from Mexico. I only put one in there. This is Zephranthes drummondii. This grows in Texas and New Mexico and down into Mexico. To me, it's about the most fragrant of them. I think it's very, very fragrant. And it's one that I like the foliage of as well. It's got this nice blue foliage. It'll bloom usually in the afternoons into evening, spring through summer. They're called rain lilies because where they're native in these very dry areas, they're bulbs. They don't flower until it rains, and then they'll flower. Some of them in the kind of southeast, they call them hurricane lilies because you're hot and dry over the summer, and then you get a hurricane and they start flowering. For us in the little less dry east, they'll really bloom really from spring and summer, just kind of pretty consistently while they're getting rain. So they're really long show for those, and they'll bulk up. You'll get more and more bulbs. If they ever stop flowering for you, you can dig them up and divide them and spread them around a little bit, but they're pretty reliable plants. Now these are white. They'll open for a couple of days, and then they kind of turn pink as they're closing and fading. But you can get other species and selections of rain lilies that are yellows and pinks and primrose yellow and bright yellow and oranges and almost true reds and bicolors. There's really a lot that's going on with rain lilies out there, and they're almost all of them are just easy plants. Now, this is a plant that I first got as an annual plant. It wasn't supposed to be hardy for me. Scutellaria subfrutescens Texas rose. This is Mexican skullcap. And it was one that was found back in the mid 80s by David Creech, who I mentioned going to Mexico with, by he and the great Texas plantsman Lynn Lowry. They found this in Mexico, and it passed it around for a bit. And in the mid 90s or so, I think, Tony Avent finally named it Texas Rose. Such a good plant. Really dense, tight mounds, only growing to about 6 or 8 inches tall. And, over time, they can grow to almost, 24 inches, 30 inches across. And they bloom mostly in spring. This is a picture in spring, but then sporadically on through to summer. It's one that I got it as an annual. I put it in the plant, and I always do what I call I planted it out, and I do what I call composting in situ. When I used to plant more annual plants, I'd let them die out there and let them compost in place. But this just kept going and kept going and kept going, and wound up having it for many years until I moved from the place. And it's one of those plants that as long as I have enough sun to grow it, I will always grow this plant. It is just that good of a plant. There are some other forms. This is one called sweet cream, which is a little bit slightly taller with a white flower. It's kind of hard to find now for some reason. And there's one that's called cherry out there. None of them are really as good as Texas rose. That's the best. But they're closely related to the sages. And Mexico has a lot of salvias. One of the more popular ones in recent years is Salvia microphylla hot lips. I have to admit, I don't think it's as great a plant as some of the other ones that are out there. The bicolor flowers are really cool up close, but I think from a distance, they're not as showy. But that's just me. The Salvia microphylla and the related Salvia greggii, and I'll get into them, they're very closely related, and often some of the cultivars are really hybrids between the two. They flower, they start in spring. They're one of the earlier sages to flower in the spring, and they will just kind of keep flowering all summer long. And with hot lips, when they flower in the spring and when they're flowering in the fall, this is what you'll get. This, what you see in this picture is this real nice bicolor, white with then red on the edges of the tips of the petals. But as temperatures get warmer and warmer and warmer over the summer, hotter and hotter and hotter, they will tend to go all red over the summer. So if you grow this and it's, you know, middle of July, August, you know, this time of year, and your plant is pretty much red, it's not a problem with the plant. It's just, that's what it does. As it cools down a little bit, it'll get a little bit more bicolor again. The greggii, if you have a hot, dry spot, it's very hard to beat them in terms of a great plant. This is one called Diane, nice, been around for a long time, nice purple one. Here you can see flame in the front and lipstick in the back. The hardest thing to deal, I always tell people, the hardest thing with the greggii is figuring out how to keep them tidy, how to keep them looking good. The best things you can do are, one, plant them in a very lean soil. That keeps them from really stretching too much. But they grow kind of like rosemary or something like that, where they have woody stems. And if you try to prune them back really hard, usually it kills them. So you never want to prune back beyond where there's leaves and things. So what I usually do is I let them they have a great flush in the spring, and then they'll still have flowers on them, but I'll give them a quick buzz and just cut back into some of these leaves a little bit and trim it back. It'll start flowering again in just a couple of weeks, and that keeps it a little bit tight. And I find it best not to do any pruning on them over the winter, except maybe taking off the old, you know, where the flower stalks were, but not really cutting back into the foliage much at all over the winter. You can do it lightly, but otherwise they don't do as well. So you can see this is one that's been trimmed back a couple of times, and so it's kind of nice and tighter and fresher. Whereas you see this, you can see old stems in there, and this is kind of breaking apart. So my feeling is it's best to keep them trimmed every year, even with young plants, to go ahead and do it every year, so that they really branch well and they don't get those really long branches, older branches. And you know, when they start getting too leggy and you're not real happy with how they're looking, get rid of them and then buy a new one. You know, there is a point at which sometimes plants are alive and fine, but just they don't look great anymore. So just replace them. You can get these cheap. They probably get, you know, a whole bunch of different types from down at Big Bloomers or wherever you shop. You can get them. So don't hold on to them too long. Cypresses, the cypress. I mentioned the Monterey cypress that they grow out there, much better than we do. But there's also Cypresses arizonica, another one which grows well that grows native in the southwestern US, but into Mexico as well. Sapphire skies is one of my favorites. It's a little bit harder to come by than some of the other ones, but it's neat. And if you like something a little bit different, this one from actually out of New Zealand, it was introduced from New Zealand. Limelight is another great one. These do get to be big plants, and unless you're trimming them and keeping them smaller and pruning them, they will open up with time and become kind of large, more open, flat top trees over a long period. And, you know, if you're planting them for that nice pyramidal shape, again, either prune them regularly, or when they start to outgrow that, get rid of it and replace it. I'm going to convince people that it's okay to get rid of plants one of these days. But that's, I do think it's nice to do that. And, you know, do it over Christmas and use the greens or blues or yellows, as the case may be, in your decorations. That's what we do. When we take out a plant, when we take out a conifer, Chris will say, hey, we're going to have our wreath workshop this winter. Can we wait until late fall to take it out? And then we'll cut it down, and right before then, and y'all get branches doing our wreath workshops. You know, flowering trees, some stuff that we're real familiar with here, right? Cornus Florida, that's, you know, it's our state tree. Flowering dogwood, the really bizarre form that you get in Mexico, this subspecies or variety Pringlei or Urbaniana. Now I've confused. I think is Urbaniana the current one? Chris, you can type in the chat. I've been using both names for so long that now I can't remember which one's which. But you see, is the dogwood. You know, these are the flowers in the middle, and these are the bracts. Every once in a while, you'll find some of our native trees that stick together like this. But in my experience, that in our native populations, you almost never get that where it happens year after year. But the Mexican form always does that, and it's a really cool, funky little thing. I saw great big trees of these in Mexico that were doing this. Not easy to get pictures of the flowers really good. This is a picture from the Arboretum, but it grows well for us. It'd be great if somebody were to do some breeding and get a little bit more powdery mildew resistance in there, but keep that closed bract form on there, because people always love that. So in a couple weeks, I'm going to be talking all about styrax, all about snowbells. There are quite a few through Mexico. We've grown several of them. Styrax platanifolia has been one of the better ones for us. There are several subspecies of this, including texensis, which we have a nice plant of, which is an endangered plant. Styrax platanifolia is sometimes called the sycamore leaf styrax. Styrax platanus is sycamore, and folius obviously leaf. Leaves aren't really as big as a sycamore, but they are a little bit broader than many other ones. Really grows in that northeastern Mexican range. It's more of a shrub than a tree. It'll grow to 15 or maybe even 20 feet tall. Real typical styrax flowers, and they're in nice clusters, so it is a very showy plant. I think it's real handsome, and it has done well for us. Grown some other ones like Styrax glabrescens. We had that in the Laugh House for a while, for several years in the early 2000s. And in our records, it just says it was removed for collections management, which is something we put in kind of when we're getting rid of a plant for no real reason. But if you look a little bit closer in our records, you look at its size history, you see, we planted it and it was 1 foot tall, and it grew to, 3 feet, 7 feet. And then the next year it was 2 feet tall, and it grew, it obviously, even in the protection of the Laugh House, was getting killed back in winters pretty regularly. And I think that probably it was gone before I got here. I think probably it was taken out because it just wasn't hardy enough to keep it going. So, there is variation, and there's variation, there are high elevations in Mexico. I mentioned at the beginning, I was talking about that tree form of butterfly bush, Buddleia cordata, that grows up as high as 9,000 feet in Mexico. When you start getting real high in Mexico, sometimes plants have a hard time with our heat because it never actually gets that hot in some of those spots. So it's if it were easier to collect in the mountains of Mexico and there were less issues with, that's where people are growing coca and poppies and things like that. It was fewer gangs there. The goal was always to get up in the mountains and Tamaulipas and places like that and find, you don't just want Styrax platanifolius, you want it from high elevations because this may grow over a broader range. And, it's all about getting those cold hardy forms when we're talking about Mexican plants. Another Mexican plant that people get really excited about, Magnolia tamaulipana. Isn't this a lovely flower? This is the closest relative to our southern magnolia. This is as close as it gets. And there's been a selected form that's a little bit hardier than the species and a little bit nicer called Bronze Sentinel that comes out with kind of bronzy new growth, which you never see in our native southern magnolia. But I think Arboretum friend and taxonomist, plant lover, gardener, John Grimshaw in his New Trees book really put it best when he said, if there were no comparisons to be made, Magnolia tamaulipana would be considered dashingly handsome. For those of you who know John Grimshaw, you can probably hear that in his British accent. But in a contest with the Southern Belle, it's just, there's no denying that the Southern Magnolia is just a better plant. So if you love magnolias and you want something different, by all means, Magnolia tamaulipana. If you're really just looking for a beautiful evergreen magnolia, Southern magnolia type magnolia, get a named form of Southern magnolia. It's a much better plant. More petals on the flower, bigger flowers, and most importantly, a better form. Magnolia tamaulipana always seems to be kind of open and not as great. Another form of a variety of one of our beloved natives, our one of our premier collections here at the Arboretum, Cercis canadensis, variety Mexicana. There is some integrating between Mexicana and Cercis canadensis, subspecies texensis, and some people think that it's only one thing. And it may be the case that one kind of fades into the other. Typically, if you show me a plant, I can tell it when it's in leaf, I can tell you whether it's Mexicana or canadensis. Typically, Mexicana will have a smaller leaf. It's usually more in the 2 to 4 inch size with a very ruffled edge around it, very rounded leaf. Whereas texensis will be larger, 3 to 6 inches and even larger than that in some cases, 8 inches, very, very thick, thicker than variety Mexicana and very glossy. The Arboretum actually named a selection Bonita, which is supposed to have very small, very wavy leaves. I'm not sure if that form has been lost to cultivation. There's somebody in that I've been corresponding with in Europe who has a plant named Cercis mexicana bonita. So hopefully the true thing, and hopefully we can get some scion wood and get that grafted and get that back in cultivation, because it really, from everything I've seen, it's a really very beautiful plant. Another one very similar, Commons virginiana variety mexicana. This is the Mexican form of our native witch hazel. And this is it growing right out in front of the McSwain Center. So it flowers for us while the leaves are still green. So flowers pretty early in fall, late summer, fall. But actually, it's kind of attractive. It's not our super bright color. It's kind of a creamy yellow-white. But against that foliage and against that wall, I think it's very attractive. I like that a lot. Tree's been tough. It's obviously been planted here in a very protected spot right by McSwain Center. So it gets a little bit of retained heat because our walls are 2 feet of concrete, you know, behind that wood. It doesn't get a lot of heat that's coming from inside McSwain that gets radiated through those walls, but it does, it's in a very protected little area, and it gets kind of the heat that builds up in the wood and is released in the evenings. So it's perhaps more of a zone 8 plant, but cited correctly, as the British should say, it's a wall plant. So planted against a wall, and it seems to do very well. Now, I showed you that Clethra mexicana with a massive, massive trunk on there. This is Clethra pringlei. This has been a Clethra that's been much more successful for us in the Raleigh area. This grows larger than our native Clethra barbonervis. It'll grow, Clethra alnifolia. It'll grow a little bit more like the Japanese Clethra barbonervis, in that it would like to make kind of a multi-stemmed small tree rather than a shrub if it were allowed to. And one's just coming into flower. You can see kind of the little fingers of flowers that are going to be coming up. That'll be spikes of little white flowers held in clusters. Pollinators love them. As it gets older, and you can trim up some of this, the bark gets very nice. It'll peel off, show like cinnamon and white. Not quite as nice as the Japanese and barbonervis and Chinese barbonervis, but still very, very nice. It's got a wide range, and there's been some work trying to find the most cold hardy forms to really get into the trade. Yuckandu Nursery, who's responsible for getting many of these Mexican plants into the trade, selected one called Whitewater that had much longer flowers. They would kind of come up and arch over. They looked almost like sourwood flowers. But they're down in Texas, Mercer, is that right? No, outside of Hampstead, Texas, outside of Houston. And they were not quite as concerned with cold hardiness. And so botanic gardens, a lot of us through the Southeast, we didn't necessarily have good records of what was what. You might have bought plants from Yuckandu over several years, or from Woodlanders or one of these other places, and we might have the same plant, but we might not have the same clone of the plant. So a lot of us kind of trade these around and kind of keep track of which ones are which, so that we can figure out the hardiest forms. And once we kind of get settled on that, maybe we'll put a name on that so that people know that this is the one that we really should grow, because there are some that will die back regularly even in a mild winter. So you got to get the right forms. Another one that's maybe familiar, beautyberry, Calicarpa acuminata. We have Calicarpa americana in the southeast with the bright purple berries. The Mexican beautyberry has much darker colored berries. They range from this kind of burgundy to almost black, but they appear in these big clusters all down the stems. It is not as nearly as elegant as many of the Asian ones, or at least the more common Asian ones, and it is not as unusually colored as our native Americana with the bright purple berries, but it is striking. And in my experience, the birds leave the berries on this one alone. So you can have berries for quite a ways into winter until they start kind of looking ugly. Now, Calicarpa acuminata is not quite as hardy as the other ones, at least stem hardiness. So we typically will go ahead and cut our Calicarpa acuminata back almost to the ground, just within a couple of inches of the ground, and let it re-sprout each year, and it will flower and fruit each year when we do that. There have been times when I've left it and not cut it back, and sometimes the tops don't die, but I usually always wish that I had cut it back, because then it starts to become big and gangly, and there's a lot of dead in there that I have to go back and snip out once it starts growing. So I just recommend people to go ahead and cut it back when it really goes dormant, before spring. Anyway. And one that was introduced by Woodlanders Nursery down in Aiken, South Carolina. And Woodlanders are terrible about naming plants. This could have a great, name like winter icicles or something. So Foresteria angustifolia is a plant in the olive family. It has kind of narrow, kind of olive green leaves during the summer. It is a plant that when you grow the normal plant, it grows upright and kind of rangy, and it's the kind of thing you might see in a botanic garden, but most people are not really going to want one in their own homes. But they found this weeping form and took cuttings and rooted it, and it roots easily from cuttings, which is unusual for a weeping plant. And it is, I think, one of the most beautiful plants during the winter. Now, this is just coming into spring, and if you look carefully, you can maybe see some little kind of black dots along the stems. Those are the flowers opening up, not showy. It'll leaf out, and when it leaves out, it kind of looks like a haystack, unless you've done a lot of pruning in there and really kind of treat it like a large living bonsai. But then when the leaves fall, it is just gorgeous to me, those silvery gray stems over the winter. And it really is a plant that benefits from yearly pruning, pretty vicious pruning, and really trying to clear things out inside so you can see the stems and you can kind of really see the form of this plant. It'll grow into a big old honking sucker. It'll grow 8+ feet tall and well wider than that if you let it. So that's another good reason to prune it regularly. But I think it's an underused plant, and wish it had a better name, but cool thing nonetheless. Oh, an introduction from the Arboretum from one of JC's trips to Mexico. This is Illicium mexicanum, Aztec fire. It's a large flowering Illicium. Those flowers are easily 2 to 3 inches across. Flowers mostly in the spring. Makes kind of a 6 to 8 foot tall and wide shrub, not as tall growing as some of the Illicium parviflorum and floridanum types. You can see that the flowers are held on fairly long stalks, so they show up against the leaves. Like I always say with Illicium, the deer won't touch it. I saw at one point not too long ago on the university's extension website where they have a lot of plants on there. They have this on there, and they list it as having a fragrant flower. I would agree with that. It has a fragrant flower, but I don't know if everybody likes the fragrance on there because it smells kind of fishy to me, pretty off-putting. But, you know, you plant it in the woodland, you get those flowers, you get an evergreen shrub, the deer don't eat it. Even if it kind of is stinky for a few days, that's okay. It won't be a big deal. And I should say with this Alyssium, it really does prefer shade. If you put it out in full sun, you get a lot of bleaching on the leaves. So it likes at least part shade. Mahonia is another one of those group of plants that are, you know, you find here and you find in Mexico and the West Coast, and you find in Asia, and that's kind of it. It's very funny. A lot of the Mahonias that you find in the Southwest United States are spiny and prickly and as vicious a plant as you can imagine. And then as you get into Mexico, you start to get more like this Mahonia gracilis. With, you can see these leaves. There's not a spine on there. Very kinder, gentler Mahonia, and it gets these beautiful, beautiful gold flowers on reddish stems. You know, Mahonias were a favorite of JC, both from Asia and from Mexico. So Tom Ranney bred, in an effort to see if you could actually cross these, bred Mahonia aquifolium, the West Coast form, with Mahonia lanceolata, a Mexican one, which is not very hardy, and got Mahonia JC Raulston, which there was a lot of back and forth with this. He said, he got in touch with me, said, you have to put the periods in the J and C on JC Raulston. I said, well, if you're naming it for the man, you put the periods in there. If you're naming it for the Arboretum, you leave them out. So he was naming them for Dr. Raulston. So he put those periods in there. But it's a really floriferous plant. It's kind of upright and wispy like Mahonia lanceolata, but it's got more hardiness from the aquifolium. So it's really a nice plant. It's never going to be a mainstream plant because in a container it'd be kind of upright and wispy, and people wouldn't necessarily go for that as much as they might. You know, people want the little squatter plants like soft caress and things like that. But it is a lovely plant. When ours gets to be large enough to really do some cutting on, we'll probably propagate this and distribute it or sell it or get it to people in some other way. So we get asked this every week now, so I thought it ahead of time and put this in here. People ask, what's on the cart this week? We have a few things pretty cool on this cart. We've got Adena rubella purple flower, the purple Chinese button bush. If you got our e-newsletter recently, you saw a picture of our 2020 shirt that we're going to be offering for sale this year. It features one of the 4 flowers that's featured on there is this Adena, which looks very similar to a certain virus we've all gotten to know very well. So, you know, if you haven't looked through that e-newsletter, look at it. It's a great shirt that the staff came up with. I'm really excited about it. I can't wait to get one myself. Another great plant, a perennial hot pepper. So this has grown at juniper level plant delights for the last 2 years, which means it's at least hardy to zone 9 because it's, you know, we haven't had a real winter. But it grows up to 4 or 5 feet tall and then gets little peppers that, you know, they're like normal peppers. They start green, then they go all kinds of yellow, orange, red, and they are spicy. They are spicy, and they hang around on the plant even after the top's been killed. So you need good winter drainage. And what I would do is, if you get a plant of this in the fall, take a couple of the fruits off, get the seeds out, let them dry on a natural surface, put them in a, you know, a little foil packet or something, write the name on it so you don't forget, put them in your fridge, and then sow them again. If we have a cold winter and your plant doesn't come back, plant them in the, you know, you can plant new ones and grow them just like you would any pepper. So even if it's not completely hardy, you should be fine. Aryngium aquaticum, variety Ravenellii. This is a southeastern native rattlesnake master. It's a herbaceous perennial. We're growing it both in our pond and in the cascade out in front of McSwain and in our xeric garden, and then in just our regular garden. It seems to grow anywhere as long as it's given sun. Very easy. Got a good edible fig that starts bearing at a young age, Alma. We love that one. A little hens and chicks. This is Jova barba instead of sempervivens, but it's a really good one. It's perfectly hardy and very good for us. An Asian fern, Onychium Sichuan lace, a very ferny fern. It's called carrot fern because it looks like the tops of carrots a little bit, or what I always say, it looks like a rabbit's foot fern. It spreads. It will make a ground cover. Don't come back to us and say that we didn't tell you that it spreads, because it does. But it's deer proof, and if you want a nice patch of something lacy and airy and light in your woodland, it's great. You plant that, let it spread for a bit, and then if you want to plant a tree right in the middle of there, you just go in there and, you know, dig a hole out, put your tree in, replant it. Ferns are great under trees because they don't really have, their root systems are different than a lot of other plants, and they don't compete for water in the same way. A true sempervivum hens and chicks, lavender and old lace. This is one that's kind of silvery blue-gray with pink tips. And then one of the tiny-leafed Asiatic jessamines, Trechilospermums. This one has gold leaves. They merge orange and then go gold. I use it as small-scale ground cover in my garden at home, and that's how we use it here. They will climb. The leaves will start to get a little bit bigger as they climb. It'll flower as it climbs, but if you keep it from climbing, it'll stay really small and stay as like a very, very low flat ground cover, but you can let it go up as well. Whew. All right. Happy to answer questions if people have questions.
There was one question in the chat that I couldn't answer because it's going to be an opinion-based one for you.
Oh, yeah.
And Marilyn wanted to know why sapphire sky is your favorite over blue ice.
I like the color of sapphire skies a little bit better. I think it's a little bit more blue than gray. I think as a young plant, blue ice has a little bit better form, but I think blue ice loses its form quicker than sapphire skies. But it's opinion.
What about size? Are they going to be the same size or not?
Yeah, if you let them grow until they don't want to grow anymore, they'll get to be huge trees. You know, despite what I'm sure they say on the internet and on the you know, on their plant tags, they will get to be, Cypresses arizonica gets to be a large plant, and these are not dwarf forms. They are just different color foliaged forms. So, you know, they can get 40, 50, 60 feet tall ultimately. They tend not to last that long here. Their root systems on some of these Cypresses, they grow in mountainsides and really rocky soils. And so their root systems are really made to go into the rocks and really hold on like that. So they'll grow on mountainsides and get hit by, you know, falling rocks and snow where they grow in really cold areas and things like that and be fine. We put them in we've done our soils up nice so that they can grow. We plant them in that, and the roots, they root out, but they don't root deeply. They're not set to go down deep. They're set to stay where there's a lot of air. So, they don't go down. So as they get bigger and bigger, they catch wind more and more. So you don't see 40 and 50 foot tall ones in this area, because when they get that big and we have a windstorm, they catch all that wind, or we have a snowstorm and we get all that wet snow on there and they peel over. So it's another one that I just think you plan on replacing them. Before they get so big and unwieldy, if you know what plants are going to do, and you say, I'm going to grow this plant for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and I'm going to get rid of it and plant something else, it's not such a hard thing to do. Does that answer that question?
Yeah. I'm just curious. I'm just curious. I have one of each. One is much younger than the other. You said that the blue ice has a better form when it's younger, maybe. So what happens to blue ice's form when it gets older? What's it doing? It's not as pyramidal, or what?
Yeah, no, it'll really stop being pyramidal. It'll open out quite a bit more. You'll start to lose lower branches in there as they get shaded out. Yeah.
Okay.
I
All
mean,
right,
same thing with like a pine tree. You get one and it starts off as a very pyramidal tree, and over time it becomes more and more flat topped and open and less pyramidal.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Okay.
That was it in the chat.
All right.
I actually do have another question about the Salvia greggii, if that's okay to ask.
Ask all you want.
I've got two of them. I forget what it's called. It's sort of a hot coral color. And I knew that they needed good drainage, so I mixed permatil in with my soil, because I've got clay. And it's got compost and everything else in it. It's improved. It's not just clay. And they just never thrive. Do I just need to rip them out and give up? Or is there anything I can do to help them out?
Well, what I would say, if you want to grow plants like Salvia greggii and similar, consider building a raised bed or a berm where you have very, very well drained soils, like our scree garden, where it's very, very well drained. And then you can plant all these things like that in there. If you're really putting permatil in a hole that you're digging, that water gets stuck in that hole. It's just, the plant really needs the environment to be well draining, and you cannot make a hole well draining very easy. The best thing you're going to do, if you want to make a singular hole well draining, go out when you dig your hole as deep as you're going to dig it for your plant, then get a post hole digger and go down as deep as you can with it and fill that with water, so the water drains out of there. But if you just mix stone or permatil or anything else back into the backfill for that one hole, it really, that tends to hold water more than anything else. You'd probably be better off just planting in your amended clay, just planting the plant like halfway out of the ground, and then mulching up over that half root ball that's out of the soil.
That's sort of what I did with one. It's on a slope, and it's underneath a red leaf plum tree, so it tends to be dry there because the plum tree sucks up any moisture. Mm-hmm. And it's one place that, like, iris, that Algerian winter iris is happy there, and that Long Island chrysanthemum, what's that called? Mohawk. Mm-hmm. Things that want well draining, they all seem happy there. So, but this thing it's just never thrives. The other one is in it is in a raised bed. It's right at the edge of the raised bed, and it's too well draining and too dry for, like, zinnias. The zinnias are always like, their tongues are hanging out.
Mhm.
So I don't know. Maybe is the soil too rich, do you think, that I put some of my compost in there?
If your soil is too rich, what they tend to become leggier and shorter lived, but they should grow still, but they won't be like, a nice mound will tend to really grow kind of out and
Okay.
open up.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Happy to answer more. You can type it in or unmute yourself, like Marilyn. They don't even have to be about Mexican plants. All right. Barbara says she has luck with Salvia grayi. Yeah. So lots of sun, well drained is the key for those plants.
That's why I had to get rid of mine. Started getting too much shade.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I amended my beds a tremendous amount, and I have tried to grow a few things that wanted a little bit leaner. Nope. They either get leggy or they flower themselves to death. They'll be great for a year or two, and I mean, big, spectacular, and just die. So I've learned I can't. I'm gonna have to build a bed with less compost in it if I'm going to be able to grow some things.
Well, that looks like all the questions, Mark.
All right. Well, thank y'all all. This has been fantastic as usual. I appreciate y'all all joining me, and I'll see you next week. If you want to talk about where to get some of these plants that I'm always talking about, we're going to talk about mail order plants.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
Oh yeah. Oh, I got some great nurseries that you haven't heard of that we're going to be doing.
We'll see you all next Wednesday.
All right.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
Forward to seeing you too. Take care.